Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author, but I also run the activities in the centre. And one of my most favourite things to do is to interview my fellow authors who are working in the fantasy area. And today I'm so delighted that I'm being joined by Tim Hall, and we're going to be discussing all things to do with Robin Hood, who is one of those mythic figures who pops in and out of pseudo history and fantasy all over the place. So we'll be talking about Robin Hood. And this is because Tim's book, The Shadow of the Wolf, which is the first part of a trilogy, has just been reissued, but we'll get to that in a minute. So first of all, hello, Tim.
Hello, Julia. Hi. Thanks for having me.
So, Tim, you actually publish under TK Hall, if people are Googling you. I'll just put that out there. But I suppose I wanted to ask you, Tim, who is your first Robin Hood?
My first Robin Hood, yes, I was thinking about this earlier. And, I hadn't thought about it until recently, but I've now kind of just twigged that there are two first Robin Hoods, so to cheat a little bit. And I think actually they probably say an awful lot about how I then came to write a book of this type, because I was the first one. I was in primary school, and sometimes the teachers will put on a film if they've had enough, and this happened one day.
Wet weather. What are we going to do with the kids?
Exactly, and it's always feels like a treat. And one that I remember particularly that was for I don't know how old it was. It came out before I was born, but it was the Disney animated version of Robin Hood. I mean, the one that's got Robin is a fox and
completely. That's my first Robin Hood.
Yes, yeah. And it's kind of it's Robin Hood at its most playful, isn't it? That's the wonderful thing about this legend, that it can really occupy such a broad range of different storytelling tropes and types. And this Disney one is very much one end of a spectrum. It's Robin Hood at its absolute most fun. It's full of songs, and Robin beats the sheriff through guile and trickery rather than any kind of violence. And so that was a very early thing for me. But then around about the same time, and this is something that I'd almost forgotten until I was thinking about it earlier, that there was a BBC program called Robin of Sherwood.
Oh, yes.
In the 80s. And I don't know how old I was, but I think I must have been about 7 or 8. And therefore, I don't really even remember that much about it. But I remember the atmosphere of it. I remember that it was almost the opposite of where that Disney film took place. It was very much, it wasn't the Greenwood anymore. It was a mist-filled, mysterious wildwood. And it featured Herne Hunter as this sort of half man, half stag sort of figure. And I'm not sure I really understood any of it. I was probably too young for it. And sometimes when you're too young and don't understand these things, they stick pretty deep, don't they? Because you kind of you're left.
I wasn't too young for it, so I can tell you. I think the listeners will understand the atmosphere if I say the theme music was by Clannad. It's Enya, isn't it, the singer? And the actor, it had two actors. It had like a reincarnation of Robin. So it started off with an actor called Michael Praed, who was this tall, dark, handsome, I remember, Robin Hood. And then he morphed into Jason Connery, who's Sean Connery's son, took over. And you're exactly right. It was definitely the mythic Robin. So that's interesting, because that makes an awful lot of sense when I sort of go to look at where you've drawn on the legend in your book. I suppose what about other notable Robins that you may have considered and rejected along the way? Because there have been others. Kevin Costner.
And I was yes, I can almost say I think I'm probably a fan of all of them. Just about. I'm not sure I ever saw the Russell Crowe one, but I yeah, and in print too. I love the Robert Pyle Robin Hoods. They're sort of more for children, but they've got a lovely tone about them. Um, and yeah, they even and right back now to the original ballads. There's all sorts of, but what I suppose what the those first two perhaps did for me was it's almost like they clashed together,
Mm.
and there was this sort of strange dissonance that said to me, even though I didn't remotely understand what was going on there, there was a sort of feeling of how can these both be Robin Hood? They what is it that they how can these legends and these myths change so radically and undergo such transformations and yet somehow hold some of the core of what they are? And why do they do that? And how do they do that? I think that was what fascinated me, and it still does. I find that so thrilling about storytelling and about myth making that they can metamorphose in such a way that they can be so different. And I think that's largely what I enjoyed about writing my Robin Hood was, or discovering what I thought the kind of the core of it was. What can you strip away and still be left with something that is a Robin Hood legend? And what are those elements that we need? And what are yeah, that's I think that fascination has stayed with me. Not just Robin Hood, but any of those mythical characters and any of those legends, Boudica or Thor or whatever it might be. The way that they transpose over time is
Yeah,
something that
King
has
Arthur,
always
I think, is the other one in the
yeah
same sort of breath as Robin Hood, isn't it? Um,
yeah yes, exactly.
so I was reminded when I was reading your story, um, by the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, when there's the voiceover from Galadriel saying history became legend, legend became myth. And it made me think that perhaps all Robin's stories are found somewhere along this line in where they think they sit. And I think it'd be quite a good scene setter, if you don't mind, just reading your um, is it like a kind of preface or an epigraph at the front of your story, which I think sets the table for your telling.
Certainly, yes. Yeah, I'd be delighted to. First, forget everything you've heard. Robin Hood was no prince, and he was no dispossessed lord. He didn't fight in the Crusades. He never gave a penny to the poor. In fact, of all those Sherwood legends, only one holds true. Robin was blind. No, even that's not right. Truer to say, Robin Hood didn't see with his eyes. Perhaps, after all, he was the only one who saw clearly in this place of illusion and lies. Forget, too, all you know of Marian. She was never a nun or an abbess, much less a damsel in distress. She was the destroying angel, the most desperate and deadly of them all. Look around you and listen. A wasted world now, shrunken and burned, a howling winter and a silent spring. But it's all still here, lurking amid the mist. A world of gods and monsters rolling their final dice. A time of heroes and demons, and the horror that shadows both. The world of Robin Hood.
Thank you. So you mentioned that thinking about it, you had these sort of clashing Robins. The sort of Disney, I think the Disney one is a little bit Errol Flynn, the sort of
Yes. Yes.
the Fox is the Men in Tights type playful. I think it's picking up on that tradition. And then you've got the mythic Robin of Sherwood one. So how did you actually then come to sit down somewhere, presumably in the early 2010s, somewhere around there, because your book was first published in 2014? How did you actually, what was the spark that made you sit down and write this?
Yeah, and it was a very specific spark. As I tell it now to myself, anyway, sort of memory could be a bit slippery, kind of.
Yeah.
But I yes, so obviously there was obviously a fascination with these English legends, but King Arthur too. But it was when I went, I was working as a journalist in London and took a sabbatical to go traveling in South America. And as part of that trip, I went to the Amazon rainforest. And we, my girlfriend at the time is now my wife, together we took this journey by canoe. We asked a couple of fishermen to take us along the waterways into the Amazon. We went quite a long way and, well, traveled a few days into the Amazon. And it was there in this most amazing place. Something kind of shifted in me. I suppose up till then, my relationship with the natural world had been, I'd grown up in England in this very temperate landscape that I'd never kind of felt threatened by it particularly. We'd had, holidays in Devon and playing in the stream, that sort of thing. It was all very, I suppose, very Disney. It was all very Greenwood.
Mm.
And then suddenly here I was in the rainforest, in the jungle, and it was an entirely different and such an alien landscape for me to be in. And yeah, again, I felt so entirely out of my depth. There was we saw what we thought was logs floating half submerged in the water that turned out to be crocodiles, and there were snakes disguised as vines, and there were howler monkeys calling from everywhere and nowhere, it seemed. And it was this most extraordinary environment. And it was there, I think, that I felt kind of connected to the wilderness in a way that I never had before. And it was honestly pretty daunting. There was a morning where we woke up, we came out of our tents, the fishermen had put up hammocks. We came out of our tent in the morning and the fishermen had gone, and we were completely alone. We're 3 days into the jungle. And it just hit us that we were that far out of our element. We had no idea how to hunt or fish or how to survive in this place in any way. And at the same time, there were thankfully they came back. They'd been out early morning fishing for our breakfast, and they made this amazing fish stew for breakfast. But then there were moments of extraordinary wonder as well. We went out into this one evening at dusk, we went out into this forest lake, and things started bumping against the boat, and we were worried about what this might be because we'd seen crocodiles and things. But then the fishermen were laughing and pointing, and it was pink river dolphins that were kind of bumping against the boat. So it was this magical, threatening, menacing, mysterious place and for some reason, whatever, it was already in me, as it were, the English landscape and the stories of Robin Hood. I started thinking about Sherwood Forest and would Sherwood once upon a time have seemed like this to people when England was covered in woodland? Lots of it would have been unknown, unexplored, would have had dangerous animals in it and outlaws at various times. So would it started ideas about people's relationship with forest and what that means and what it's like, what it would be like, as much as anything else, to get back to a relationship with the earth where you are surviving and in a more sort of primal way of life. And so that was really the starting point was the Sherwood Forest. It wasn't Robin so much. It was an idea of forest. And then I came back to England and started working in London again and felt the city pressing in on me. And then I worked in Bermuda for a while and came back to England, and we settled in Gloucestershire where we've got woodland. And so that original seed from the Amazon grew for years and years until I think you know what it's like with storytelling. You've got this seed growing and growing until you just can't kind of hold it anymore, and it has to spill out onto the page. And so eventually, I got on writing it.
That makes an awful lot of sense, because when I think about how you've written about the wildwoods, it does feel like a jungle without the tropical elements. And I think what you've just described is when we think back to this sort of medieval-ish period that we're talking about, you have to sort of flip the tree cover from being little patches to the cleared areas being the little patches and the wood being everything else, until it was cleared by Normans for their hunting purposes and what have you. And I think that's really brilliantly evoked in the story, just how we now talk about the urban jungle, don't we? So we have
Yes,
feelings
yes.
about cities, but actually for them, it would have been that feeling about the forests that they do not control, they cannot control, that has wolves and boar and the other things, bears, I suppose, the other things that were the predators at the time. Just interestingly, I'm thinking that of all the films, not Kevin, the Russell Crowe one does try and bring the harshness of that world into its story, but there's a lack of trees, I think. Not much trees. But it does seem to try and get to that grit, which I think you've also captured. So this is a revised version of your 2014 version for a new edition. And you were saying to me just before we came online that you have actually revised it a little bit. What kind of changes have you made because you're looking at it pretty much, well, a decade on? How's your thoughts and feelings about the story changed?
Yes, yeah. As you say, it first came out in 2014. The trilogy took me a lot longer than I originally planned for various reasons. I got very bogged down in the second book, as happens, and yeah, just overthinking it, and not sort of reaching the quality that myself or the publisher, David Fickling Books, wanted. And so yeah, so it became a long process, and I think I learned a lot in the meantime. So all three books are finished now, and by the time I got to the end of the third one, I think I knew a lot more about storytelling than I did when I started this first one. So there were always things about the first one that wouldn't quite work for me, no matter how much I tried to make them. And I think that was part of the problem, really. I was over trying to make everything. Yeah, it was a sort of a perfectionism. But at the same time, by the time I got to the end of the third book, I could look back at the first one, and there were quite a few structural things that I wasn't happy with that I was able to address in some revisions. So it was largely a abridgment of the first sort of third of the book. I did a fair bit of cutting down to make the time frame run more smoothly. That was the thing that bugged me the worst in the book. I mean, I think you're always going to have elements of a novel that you're not 100% happy with because it can't be perfect. So there's still things I would change if I could, but
Yeah.
at some point you have to give it over, don't you? And I've given over again, and it's good.
Yes, and also that thing of writing a trilogy. People sort of say, "Oh, yes, fantasies, they're trilogies." I mean, it's actually it's hugely difficult to orchestrate something like that and make all the pieces click into place.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's yes, it's perhaps people underestimate how hard that is, and hence a lot of trilogies will disappoint in the second and third books because it's very, very hard to get all those pieces to fit again. And I know so I am. It's taken a lot longer than I wanted to, but I am very pleased that I feel like it's a trilogy that does get better and better as the stories go on, and that's quite rare, I think. And so
That's certainly
yeah,
the right direction to go in.
no, yes, exactly, yes, yeah. So the second book comes out in October, so I'm looking forward to seeing if people agree. But I personally feel like it's a lot stronger than the first book. Yeah, so I feel like the themes that wanted to come out in the first book, the core and the heart of the book that wanted to come out in the first book really do in the second book, and the third one even more so. It becomes the story that I think Robin Hood, as we started to talk about at the beginning, the legend of Robin Hood transmutates over time and goes through all these amazing shifts and can cover such a big range. And as I say, I was trying to kind of distill down what my Robin Hood, what can you take away and still have Robin Hood? And I feel like in the end, it's almost all of it. You can take away him taking from rich to give to the poor. As I say, perhaps in the first page of my book, you can take away almost everything, even his bow and arrow, and you've still got. But the one thing you can't take away from Robin Hood is the forest. I feel like that's his element. That's where he is, and he represents the spirit of the forest, and therefore I feel like he represents the spirit of the earth. He is and in this series, he doesn't understand that in the first book, but as it goes on, he becomes the guardian of the forest, and I feel like it's very much a book about our relationship with nature and
Mm.
where what we've done to the planet and what we continue to do and how we might fight to change things.
So, in that rather helpful way of publishers, the story comes with a sort of quote saying that it's compared with Game of Thrones and X-Men. Do you see what's meant by these comparisons? Or, I mean, I can hazard a guess, but
And
if you,
I just know why do you ask? Do you not see the
I do
comparisons?
see it, but well, Game of Thrones is easier. The X-Men is because of their contemporary setting within the superhero franchise that is a bit more of a stretch. But anyway, I'm not going to gloss that. Tell me why you think what you think people, because if you like Game of Thrones and you like X-Men, what are they going to find in your book that will be hitting the same, good vibes for them?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I've got to be honest. I've never quite loved that quote. I think maybe because it talks about mashup, which makes it feel like you've kind of intentionally cut out different bits of things and squished them together.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I can, as you say, I don't blame the publishers for using it for one bit because it gives people a little bit of a reference. And Game of Thrones, coincidentally, actually, I don't know how coincidentally it is, but on that travel in South America that I talked about earlier, we stayed in a hut on the edge of Brazil, and in this hut, it was completely bare except for one book on the shelf, and it was Game of Thrones, and that was before it
That's
was
strange.
famous. So I know considering, and I picked it up and thought it's been a long time since I've read any kind of high fantasy, as it were, and I thought, oh, it looks a bit dragony for me. I'm not sure I'll bother. But of course, within half a page, I was absolutely mesmerised because it's a masterwork, and I think if you're going to write a fantasy now, I think there are certain books you're going to have to answer to, and Lord of the Rings being the absolute epitome of that. But Game of Thrones too. You can't write a fantasy now without being aware that you're either following it or not following it, as it were. It,
Mm.
it changed what fantasy could do, and yeah, so yes, I'd be very pleased if anyone thought that had any of that in it. But and the X-Men thing, I think specifically they might be talking about Robin Hood in my version of of the legend. He takes on certain arcane powers from the forest. He wears the pelt of a slain wolf god, and that wolf skin can heal at a sort of supernatural rate. It's a protection. It's a bit like a Hercules cloak, I suppose.
Mhm.
That's I think in my mind was the image. Um, so yeah, so I think specifically they might have been talking about, and of course he wields this bow of pure shadow that can kill through pure fear. So I suppose yeah, I can absolutely see why. In actual fact, I think when I first pitched the book to my agent, I talked about Robin Hood being England's first superhero. So I think I was already kind of trying to steer people in that direction. But it was actually and Batman. If I often think that Batman is a big influence on it too, because
Yeah, I personally I think that's closer to
hmm,
because it's got the darkness in it, hasn't it? The
yeah,
Batman legend.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and
and
the
Robin's more like a
solitariness,
ninja. Is what? Sorry.
the solitary aspect to it being set apart.
Yes, yes, exactly. And the angst actually. Robin is quite a soul searcher, really, isn't he?
Mm.
He doesn't commit these violent acts easily. He does a lot of soul searching, whereas Marion is much more. My Marion is much more pragmatic, much more down to earth. She's a kind of um, whirlwind of action and vengeance who plot. She drives the story really. She's plotting the sheriff's downfall even when she's in a jail cell.
Mm.
She was the most fun part of the story to write, I think.
So I also thought that one area which I was very much reminded of is werewolf stories, by which I mean traditional myths and legends of werewolves, not kind of Twilight werewolves. You'd be pleased to hear. Um, in fact, because one of the things we at the Oxford Centre for Fantasy are interested in is the Inklings, and Charles Williams, who was one of the Inklings and a very interesting writer and poet, he has a very fascinating Arthurian cycle, in one of which poems Sir Lancelot turns into a werewolf. They're sort of in the style of The Wasteland. They're sort of flashes of imagery as opposed to a narrative Browning style poem. And I was thinking about that because you're definitely drawing on the idea of the wolfish element to the wood to Robin. Was there any? I suppose if maybe you know of another werewolf story which you had in the back of your mind, or was it just a natural evolution of your Robin because of his association with the dangerous sides of the forest?
Yeah, it wasn't. It wasn't specifically. I wasn't conscious of werewolf exactly. Although um, obviously he fights a creature called the Warg but I adapted that from Tolkien, and who obviously adapted it from um, the word Warg. So there was obviously so yes, I suppose it's all connected somehow. But it was less conscious. The conscious thing I think might have been the Metamorphosis, Ovid's Metamorphosis, and the Greek myths. I've always been drawn to stories of transformation, and I'm not entirely sure why. I think it might be partly to do with those themes that I've talked about nature and getting back to nature and regaining our relationship with nature, tapping back into those rhythms that we seem to have lost. And I think probably that's partly what's happening in those Greek myths of transformation. Yeah, various figures are literally becoming nature. For whatever that might symbolize. It symbolizes lots of different things, but I think that's what Robin is doing in my story. He is kind of almost literally becoming the forest. He's putting it on. He's adopting they say this wolf skin that belonged to a forest god. He is in it, and at times it takes control of him. He is gradually during the story as he's becoming the forest, and if that. I mean, yes, to some people that looks like becoming a werewolf, and he's certainly becoming something more bestial. He's certainly getting back to, yeah, something more primal, I suppose.
It's also making me think of Dune now, with that idea of, I mean, in the desert context there, the relationship with the sandworms or whatever they're called, and the sort of metamorphosis that goes on in the Frank Herbert stories. Fascinating area. But all of this raises a problem as a writer. How do you handle a character who's becoming something more than human? Because obviously we need to remain in touch with the character who we in some ways empathize with and care about. Did you find that a struggle? What was your sort of relationship with the character as Robin was changing from the kind of abused child, really, a vulnerable child, tortured child, to being this more powerful entity?
Yes, I mean, I personally didn't struggle to stay in contact with him, but whether readers do or not, I don't know. I'm it's not something I'd thought about consciously. I kind of just followed him through his journey of transformation. But yeah, I suppose the challenge, there were lots of challenges once Robin takes this, as you say, solo journey into the forest. And so there were quite a number of challenges in terms of keeping the narrative going without anyone to play off of. It's quite a lonely, long stretch of story, and that perhaps won't be for everyone. But for me personally, I think that's at the core of the book, and it's the part of it perhaps that I enjoy the most. As Robin, as perhaps we haven't, as the introduction pointed out, Robin is blind in this story, so there was that added challenge of keeping the narrative descriptive without Robin's sight, because we rely on that an awful lot.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because so many times you must be reaching for something that he's seeing when he's sensing it.
Yes, yes, and yeah, there was quite a lot of editing went on. Oh, I'll take that out. I'll see that. But at the same time, I think I think they do that in creative writing workshops, don't they? I've really taken any, but I think the sort of that sort of idea where if you limit something,
Mm.
it's actually quite good for creativity.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
and I feel like the discipline of writing a blind character in the woods was quite good. It was enjoyable because it meant I had to really sink into the other senses and find a way for Robin to sense the forest in a way that we can't. I think that's essentially, I think, why he's blind in this story, as well as as well as thinking it was going to be a good Game of Thrones twist, as it were,
Mm.
when the blinding happens. I didn't want to hide that from anyone. It was because it wasn't just for shock value. It was, I think he's blind because, as I say, the story started with the forest. That was this darker, more mysterious, more mythical Sherwood Forest that had developed in my mind. That was the start, and therefore, and Robin grew out of that. So I knew to even survive somewhere like that, this Robin Hood was going to need to sense the world in a way that's deeper than we sense it.
Mm.
And the loss of his sight was kind of almost the price he paid. You know, it's there in a lot of the old myths as
Yeah.
well, isn't it? The Norse myths, like Odin gives up an eye for knowledge of the world tree, and all the Greekness. There's always a cost to that kind of transformation, and I think that's why Robin is. It was very important that Robin was like that in this story.
Yes. And I suppose that the episode of the blinding is, it's as shocking as it is in King Lear kind of thing. Um, and this, is it pitched as YA or adult? It's somewhere on the cusp, isn't it, as a book?
It it is. Yes, it is somewhere on the cusp. Yes, I think I probably made a bit of a problem for my publisher with that. I'm not sure, but again, I think I know now a lot more about how to perhaps pitch a book at a particular audience, and I wasn't really particularly cognizant of that at the time. I just read a story that I would want to read. Um, but yes, in many ways, I think of it as more of a fantasy book than a YA book.
So
But
that's
it's
interesting, because so it meant that you weren't in any way censoring yourself in the handling of things like violence as a result, which you might have done if, say, it's obviously clearer when you're doing something like a middle grade book. You got a set of rules that you're following in similar to a sort of cinema certification, but you didn't actually have that in your mind when you were writing. I mean, they're very powerful scenes, very shocking scenes, but they're also very medieval, which is, of course, the point. It's not, it's the world
yes,
that happens to people.
yes. No, I think that's right. Again, I don't remember it being a particularly conscious decision. I just think it's probably influences as much as anything else. I love the Bernard Cornwell Arthurian trilogy, and they're very violent, very but in a way that seems to fit that world at the
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Um, and and I grew up on 2000 AD comics that are full of action violence. So I think it was, but again, it seemed very much how those worlds would be. So
Mm.
so yeah, hopefully um, it doesn't come across as gratuitous too often.
No, it
It's
doesn't. It
more
doesn't. So I would say that it's not comic book violence.
yeah
It's earned violence that's integral to a world that you're creating. So it's a very
yes.
different way of looking at it. So
Hmm.
you've already
And
mentioned
the
that you had a problem writing, particularly the middle book. Um, but you've now got the three in place. So do I take from that that you didn't set out with knowing how it ended, for example. You were setting out to see how it unfolded. Was that your writing experience?
Yes, yes, it was. I always knew it was going. I always thought it would be a bigger a series, as it felt like too big a story for one book for sure. I had a sort of vague idea how I thought the second book would go. Well, probably thinking about it, I had too good an idea of how I thought the second book would go. And that is part of what many things tangled me up. But I think one of them was, yes, but thinking I knew where I wanted the second book to go. And I've learned, I think, very much the hard way. I've written 4 books now because I wrote a book for younger children called Earthswarm, and now I'm just started on my 5th novel, and I think over those books, I think I've learned that where I should stand in relationship to planning, and I mean it's always going to be a work in progress, but I think I can definitely over plan more than under plan. I know my publisher David Fickling I think has been sort of hinting that to me from the beginning that you're better off not knowing too much about a story and
Well, that would
letting it.
follow because, of course, in David Fickling's, I don't know what they call it this day, his collection of authors is Philip Pullman, who I've heard him talking about writing into the dark, this idea that you write by exploring. And then somebody else who's been edited by Dave Fickling said that David always said to him, the pen is in your hand. So not an interventionist editor who would demand
Yes.
a plan in advance. So that's the deal you get with David Fickling.
Yeah, no, absolutely it is, and I very much value him for it. I've not always listened to his great wisdom. I've always known it wisdom when I've heard it. Um, but you probably have to make your own mistakes even when people are telling you the right way. And yes, he's the particular phrase of his that really stuck with me was he says that the place for a writer to be is one step ahead of one step ahead of the reader, one step behind the story. And that I often think of if I feel like if I am in that zone, then I'm okay. I don't want to. I always dislike the feeling that I was making it up, which is which was when I first thought that, oh, I'm just making this up. I thought that's a bit strange, but it's a feeling of being too conscious about it. If I'm consciously making up a story, then that's not where it works at all. The scenes in Shadow of the Wolf where Robin's alone and blind in the forest, those I had no idea what was going to happen next,
Yeah.
and yet I wasn't completely lost because I was building it, bit by bit, that feeling of knowing perhaps where your next footstep is, but not being able to see the end of the path. I don't know whatever the metaphor is. Dave would have a better metaphor than I've got, um, but yeah. So that's I think a large part of the game of writing stories for me is it has been very exciting. Really, as hard as and challenging as it's been, has been learning how to do it, learning what your relationship needs to be with your unconscious and how to allow these words through, and that's yeah, that's well, I think will always be low, but I feel like I now have a much better feel. The third book of this trilogy, for instance, I feel like it had several false starts, but that's only because not only because, but the characters were finding out how to then relate to the first and second book. But once they did, then they very much played out the rest of the story for me, and that happened. And the third book happened much more smoothly as a result.
So if you would like to read a modern mythic take on Robin Hood, the Blind Bowman, The Shadow of the Wolf by T.K. Hall is available now with parts 2 and 3 shortly to be with us. So what are the publication dates for part 2 and 3?
October, I think the 2nd of October anyway this year for part 2, and then part 3 is February
Oh, so
2nd.
all within the next few months. Excellent.
Yeah.
So just to sort of finish us off on a sort of cheery note, I like to ask my guests where in all the fantasy worlds that they've come across, it could be ones you've read about in books or on films or comics, really the choice is yours. I suppose video games these days as well. Where in all those places is the best place to be Robin Hood? And you can interpret it how you like. So you can take the old stealing from the rich to give to the poor version, or you could take your more mythic one. And where would you like to be Robin Hood?
Well, in all fantasy worlds, the thing that springs to mind would be Alan Moore's Swamp Thing graphic novels. They were a big sort of conscious influence on this book, and yeah, I feel like they were. I just love that world. I love being in that world. I reread those graphic novels most years, and so yeah, I'd like to see Robin Hood meet Swamp Thing. That'd
be fun.
Good face off. Yeah, that's the kind of superhero. Swamp Thing's the kind of superhero that I could relate this Robin Hood to, because he's yeah, sort of primal. He is the swamp.
I mean, it's so many intriguing places you could slot him in, isn't there? Because you could do a Thor on him and bring him into something like the Marvel universe. That'd be quite fun. That'd be fun. And
yeah,
also
well, I think Green Arrow is based on Robin Hood.
He's not English enough.
No.
Sorry, a fail from my point of view.
Yeah.
But also being the Disney one, being a fox, that'd be quite cool. But
yeah.
I was thinking that the place I wouldn't mind bringing him is the Leigh Bardugo's world, Circle of Crows, that world, which is about thieves. I think being Robin Hood there would slot right in. If you're doing the steals from the rich to give the poor, your morals are probably a bit better than most of her characters.
Yes,
in that one. But I think it'd be an interesting challenge for Robin Hood to parachute into that world.
Yes, yeah. It's a difficult question with Robin Hood, because for me, in my mind, as I say, the one thing you can't take away from Robin Hood is the
forest,
English forest. So it would have to come with him.
Yeah.
But I say as this trilogy goes on, he kind of I don't want to give too much away, actually, so maybe I shouldn't. But his powers grow to the degree where he kind of he can generate forests. So it's maybe he can take it with him.
He would be quite good, actually. You mentioned Tolkien, and of course Tolkien is often the people listening to this, their favorite author. Robin Hood in Middle Earth would be great fun, because a lot of the admirable human characters are quite sort of within the power structures, Aragorn and Faramir, and actually having a roguish thief knocking around.
Yes, yeah, no, I think that's right. I think all stories can benefit from outlaws, essentially. I mean, they've got them in, and I think that's why part of why we're so drawn back to the Robin Hood stories is the very fact of outlawdom.
Yeah.
We feel so, I think ever since civilization began, I think we've felt hemmed in by all the rules and obligations and laws, and the idea that we could just cast all that off and live free is very attractive, I think.
Merrily under the greenwood boughs.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you so much, Tim, and all the best with the reissue of this book and the completion of the trilogy within the next few months. Thank you very much for joining us.
No, thank you, Julia.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.